Well, basically, following Andreas to talk about Bitcoin is kind of like Mission Impossible. Since I'm not Tom Cruise, you guys are going to have to suffer through this. I will say that on this sort of like Bitcoin rabbit hole, where people are starting to go down that long sort of dark journey, you know, Andreas was saying that you start talking about Bitcoin all the time at social events, and your significant other is like, oh God, when will this stop? What kind of naturally happens after a few years is that you end up without a significant other, which is why you have so many people that have so much time to work on Bitcoin. Wired actually requested that I not talk about the company very much. So contrary to what David was saying about how I'm going to talk about what we're doing, I'm mostly going to talk about what sort of the possibilities are generally. Let's go into it. So this is our logo. Explodes very nicely. This is just kind of to talk about the blockchain briefly, because it's almost kind of hard to understand. You know, Andreas was saying, you know, it's slow, it's like Quicken, and that's true. Really at its core, Bitcoin is just an open access database that anyone can write to. And it's also a database that can't be changed. So you can't go back in time and fake the database. And why is this important? Well, this is important because particularly when you're proving who owns something or who has responsibility for something, knowing at what point in time something was responsible for something is very important. This is why you have huge trading breakdowns, like the $2 billion loss at UBS, because the trader was going back and changing the internal database. And so one of the advantages of a distributed database that anyone can write to is that it can't be changed in the future. But what does this really look like? Well, here's like one little database. Just pretend it's an Excel file, right? Imagine that you have, everybody has a copy of it, right? So there's thousands and thousands of these copies. And then every time something's changed, it's changed in every single one. That's really all it is. Now this is one of the things that we do at our company is we keep track of the blockchain. So you probably don't want to run your own version of it. It's possible for anyone in this room to do, but it's a little bit expensive and it takes some time. We run a hosted one. And what you're seeing now is just a live feed of transactions going through the blockchain. So this is every single time someone writes to the blockchain, you can see this roll through the feed. And so what you have is thousands, tens of thousands of people and businesses around the world writing to one database. And the first use of that database is the currency. And they're inseparable. You know, I think Andreas talked about this at length, and so I don't have to go into it as deeply. But there really is no way to separate out Bitcoin from the blockchain. They're fundamentally linked because of the security implications, but also because of the intrinsic design of the system. The system doesn't really work without it. I think that, particularly in the financial services sector, with people in this room, have gotten pretty excited about this idea of sort of a Bitcoin 2.0 or a blockchain 2.0. I can tell you as someone that's been in this space for quite some time, you know, is responsible for quite a lot of production software, that we're actually not even at Bitcoin 1.0 yet. In fact, we're at Bitcoin 0.9.5. So there will be a Bitcoin 2.0. Please check back in 7 to 8 years. So just think about it in stages. First stage, you had pioneers. So this is basically anyone who heard of Bitcoin a really long time ago. Bitcoins were under $1. The entire space was extremely nascent. Bitcoin itself, the core protocol, was quite buggy. And then you had the second wave come in, which is builders. And these are the first kind of wave of companies. So the earliest Bitcoin companies that are still functioning today is ours, blockchain, another company called Coinbase, and another company called BitPay. And we began this phase of building, right? And after that, you had more and more and more and more companies. And now you have thousands of companies that are using the core Bitcoin protocol to build all kinds of different applications, which is probably the most exciting thing about Bitcoin is the network effect, is the number of people that are involved in it. And then the last phase that you have is sort of, you know, when it starts to branch out. And we're seeing the beginning of this. So this is the advent of services that are beyond sort of value transfer or currency. So this is companies that are building things to, for example, track the provenance of diamonds, which is still tracking the transfer of value, right? It's tracking how does that valuable piece move along, but it's not actually tied to any sort of implicit value amount. It's just tied to an entry in the database itself. So, global opportunity. Andreas was talking a lot about how the sort of point of Bitcoin is that anyone can access it, right? Anyone can access, it's a completely open platform, and it's global in nature from day one. We're only about, really as a company, 2 or 3 years old. This is a map of our user base. So we need at least 10,000 users in any country before we count it. I think we had someone up on stage earlier that was talking about phenomenal growth where they'd onboarded less than 10,000 users. This is 10,000 users in every single country that's highlighted. And so this map gives you a real sense of the sort of global distribution of this network. It's very rare to see this kind of distribution in a tech company at our size and at our stage. So out of a total of 3.8 million users, you can see we have almost the entire world blanketed. We're still working on Central Africa. It turns out it's a tough market. Now, what are some of the sort of applications beyond currency transfer, right? So everybody in this room, you guys know Bitcoin. You've heard about it. A lot of people in here have used it. You know what it is to take out a Bitcoin wallet and for me to send some Bitcoin to somebody. If you don't, see me after. I'll show you. What about things beyond this? One of the most interesting to me is identity. So, one of the sort of most trendy topics at fintech conferences is regulatory. I'm not a regulatory lawyer. I'm a technologist developer by background, so please don't take anything I say too seriously on this topic. That said, you only have a couple billion people in the world that have any kind of photo identification, right? So say we have 6 billion people in the world, 7 billion people, no one's really quite sure. Maybe of that, only maximum 2.5, 3 billion have IDs, right? Of that, how many people have IDs that are up to a standard that any kind of, prove any sort of real identity, right? Think about this. Up until the year 2003, 2004, any high school student could make a driver's license in the United States of America. Anyone. Before I could have a driver's license, so before I was 16 years old, you could literally print your own, and you could be 21, and then you could, quote, legally drink in America. These weren't really proven identification, right? It's just someone printing something off a printer. So what about all these people in the world that don't have provable identity? Well, what if there was a better way to identify someone? What about crowdsourcing identity? So if I sign something into an irrefutable public ledger that says this signature represents me digitally, and then other verified people verify me. So Brian, here on the front row, is going to speak next. He knows me. He knows that I'm Peter Smith. He knows that I'm the Peter Smith that works at blockchain. And I say, Brian, please sign this, saying that you verify, you vouch for me. So Brian signs it. Andreas signs it. My friend that's known me since I was 6 years old signs it. I sign it from my Facebook account. I sign it from my Twitter account. And at some point, it gets up to this threshold, right? We can even score that threshold because we all have public access to that data. And eventually, you can start to build verifiable online identities for people that would have otherwise never had one. Now, why is this important? Well, the internet kind of gave us sort of equal access to information, right? I used to live in East Africa. People in East Africa could read the same news that people in Midtown Manhattan could. That's a fundamentally transformative thing. Previously to that, people in East Africa got news roughly 4 or 5 months late, and usually not nearly the same kind of quality. So you're plugged into the global network. You're plugged into the global world, but you can't transact, right? You can't trade with each other, which is kind of the missing second half of the picture. Bitcoin solves the ability to transact, right? Anyone in East Africa can transact with me. And in fact, I still actually pay my bills in East Africa using Bitcoin. However, no one in East Africa can prove to me who they are. And I can't really prove to them who I am, right? Because they don't really know what a valid British residence card looks like. How are they to verify that document? How are they to verify some low-quality scan? A distributed ledger, an irrefutable ledger, allows you to start building the concepts that make identity in a modern world possible. Asset tracking. So this is the idea that You have valuable items. Let's go with some that are easiest. Diamonds, right? How do you know that your diamond didn't come from a conflict zone? How do you know that it wasn't stolen? Most of you don't. Most diamonds are at some point in their life cycle stolen or from a conflict zone. But you set that aside, right? Let's talk about rare art. How do you know that your piece of rare art that you spent $5 million for, by the way, has anyone in this room ever spent over $1 million for a piece of art? There's always someone in every room I give this talk to, and no one ever identifies themselves. Can't wonder why. Anyways, continuing. How do you know it's the right piece, right? What if you could have that as an entry in a database, an irrefutable database that can't be changed? You could verify the provenance of almost any rare good, almost any expensive item. All right, you say, okay, well, maybe there's a way to do that, because there aren't really that many rare pieces of art in the world, right? Maybe you could have a centrally administered database, because there's just not that much complexity to it, which is what they do now, albeit somewhat poorly. What about financial instruments? So one of the trickiest things, for example, when you're selling loans, is keeping track of the loan over time, right? Because loans are often resold. There's millions and millions and millions of these loans. One of the biggest costs in the loan sector is actually just figuring out who's actually supposed to own the loan, right, when things go wrong. What if you could prove who owns these assets? Payment rails. I think most people in this room have heard a lot about how blockchain, and Bitcoin provide a great system for payment rails. So I'm not going to talk about it. And then this is sort of a global heat map of the internet and Bitcoin transactions. You'll see a lot of heat in North America and Western Europe, but you're starting to see this heat in Latin America, Southeast Asia. Really interesting. The store of value. So Andreas started to get into this, which is like, people today. Raise your hand if you're under 30 years old. Keep it up if you own over $1,000 worth of gold. No one. I actually have never found anyone that does in all these presentations. I think the next generation, is going to expect new ways to store value that isn't just part of the banking system, right? New long-term stores of value. And I think that one of the most interesting of these is actually Bitcoin. It's digital currencies. It's things that are not controlled by the state, things that are not censorable by the state. And when you look at the global market, right, where do all the young people in the world live today? They're in Southeast Asia, they're in Africa, they're in Latin America. What kind of assets are these people going to want to buy? Well, those are all markets that have high levels of instability, low trust in institutions, and extremely weak currencies. They also have no way to buy into other assets. If you're a 22-year-old computer programmer working on Elance or Upworthy or whatever they've renamed themselves to today, you can't buy stocks. You can't buy the S&P 500. You can't open a bank account in the States. Why? Because you don't have any ID that meets the bar. So what are you going to do? You're probably going to store some value in Bitcoin. This last one is smart contracts. This is the one that everyone's obsessed with. I'm here to disappoint you. It's not ready yet. Check back in 2 years. But hypothetically, 2 years from now, we'll be able to automate contract administration. So rather than having this entire back office that's dedicated to calculating when payments are due, at what rate, if an insurance payout has been hit, incredibly costly, we'll be able to automate these contracts so that things are completely self-administrable. And a lot of us are working on that. I think that's probably one of the most exciting things. Let's see. I think that's the end. I think that one of the things that I kind of want people to take away from this, though, because this is a group of hopefully fintech professionals, people interested in financial technology, probably a lot of people from the finance sector here. It is an open platform. So I'm not an evangelist, I'm not a philosopher. I'll leave that to people who are much better public speakers. I'm a businessman. I think there's a lot of money to be made building software for open platforms. You look at the way the entire technology space has gone, right? We've gone from everything being closed, proprietary, to everything being open. People building on gigantic, destructive, open platform networks. The world is going that way. Bitcoin is the platform that's going to take banking from being closed, totally reliant on broken, historic legacy platforms, to open, transformative. It's going to bring billions of people into that digital financial system. The question for you, whether you're an investor, whether you're working at a bank, whether you're working at a fintech startup, is how are you going to take advantage of that? How are you going to serve those new consumers coming on board? And how are you going to compete at a cost scale that we've never seen before? Thank you.
Peter, I'm going to ask you a similar question to the one I asked Andreas. You're in a government. You know all this stuff is happening. You know the community that owns Bitcoin is challenging the way transactions happen. Should you be getting into it, and how? What are the advantages for a government?
Well, I think governments, mostly sort of exist to protect their citizens in some various form or fashion and provide common services. One of those common services they provide is consumer protection. It depends on which government you're talking about as well. I spend a lot of time with regulators, a lot of my time, as probably pretty much any fintech CEO now. I think that governments that are doing a really great job, I think California, you saw a new draft of their sort of regulatory regime yesterday. They're doing a really good job, a very pragmatic, risk-based approach. I think they'll be a big winner in terms of how this whole regulatory landscape plays out. I think the British government's doing a good job. They're sort of just now interested in it. So for a long time, they were kind of, had a wait-and-see attitude. And I think they're now starting to take a very proactive approach, but a very research-driven approach, which is refreshing to see.
Does this mean, the tax office is going to start working out exactly how to use the blockchain to stop having to issue tax returns?
Not anytime soon. I think it'll be quite some time before that happens. And I think it's also likely to happen in countries that don't already have a sort of huge investment in this infrastructure already. So if you look at countries that need to start building tax systems, essentially, and there are quite a lot of them, I think they're much more likely to do something around that than any country in the Western Hemisphere. What the British government is interested in is how they can use these platforms to do aid programs more efficiently. So like DFID, for example, is considering a pilot. But that work is very different from sort of what you would need to do taxes on the blockchain.
So we've got the Bitcoin blockchain session as a kind of ringed off part of a innovation-led wired money event. So, even among this room of early adopters, we've kind of kept it separate. Mm-hmm. How do we move from the blockchain as this kind of strange new thing to taking it mainstream so it's part of the everyday conversation about finance?
I think that's already kind of happening naturally. I think Wired was actually one of the first sort of major tech events to have Bitcoin sessions a couple years ago. I think it will just gradually happen over time, though. I don't think that there will be a watershed moment. I don't think there will be a driver for it. I think that it's just a matter of time. But I think we're getting there. We're getting quite close to it.
What's going to be the trigger before our mums are starting to use the blockchain?
I don't think your mom or my mom, other than out of her loyalty to me, is ever going to use Bitcoin. I think that you're looking at people who are young, and you're looking at people who are in markets where they're not already well served. So, I don't think that your mom will ever use Bitcoin. But I do think that there are literally billions of people in other parts of the world where Bitcoin makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Peter, from Blockchain.